Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. In the last cold hour before dawn on Friday the 13th of October, in the year 1307, in a walled compound on the eastern edge of Paris known simply as the Temple, a fortified enclave of towers, stables, chapels and vaults that had stood inside the city for well over a century, and had, for most of that time, been treated by the kings of France as a place slightly outside their own ordinary reach. An old man in his early 60s was woken in his own private chamber by the sound of boots on stone, torches moving in numbers no visitor to the temple would ever have been permitted to bring after dark, and the specific, deliberately unhurried voice of a royal official reading aloud, from a sealed parchment carried under armed guard from the king's own chancery, an order for his own immediate arrest. His name was Jacques de Molay. He had spent very nearly the whole of his adult life, some 40 years by his own later account, wearing the white mantle and the red cross of an order sworn to poverty, chastity, obedience, and the defence of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. He had risen over decades of hard service on frontiers most of the men now arresting him had never once seen, to become the 23rd Grand Master of that same order, the supreme commander of the single most feared, most wealthy, and most thoroughly misunderstood military institution the whole of medieval Christendom had ever produced, and on this particular morning, in this particular city, acting on orders that had been drafted in secret weeks earlier, sealed and distributed under guard to royal officials across the whole of France, with instructions that every single seal be broken and every single arrest carried out at the very same hour on the very same day. He was taken into custody not by any enemy of his faith, not by the Muslim armies his own order had spent nearly 2 centuries fighting across the deserts of the Levant, but by the soldiers of a Christian king of France named Philip IV, a king whose own personal debts to the very order now being dismantled around its own Grand Master ran, by any honest reckoning, considerably deeper than his own public reasons for destroying it would ever openly admit. By the time the sun came up over Paris that same morning, every Templar house within the Kingdom of France that royal officials could reach had been simultaneously raided. Every senior officer who could be found had been taken into custody alongside Jacques de Molay himself. And the coordinated silence and precision of the operation, an operation that had required the drafting, sealing and secret distribution of arrest orders to bailiffs and seneschals across a kingdom that took weeks to cross on horseback, without a single leak reaching the order it targeted in time for any meaningful resistance or flight, stood as one of the most efficient pieces of state coercion the medieval world had yet produced. And it is that same morning, and the 7 grinding years of imprisonment, interrogation, and formal dissolution that followed it, that popular memory has since folded into a single dramatic date, Friday the 13th, and turned into one of the most durable superstitions in the whole of Western culture, an association modern historians treat with real scepticism, since the actual folk pairing of Friday and the number 13 as a specifically unlucky combination cannot be reliably traced back before the 19th century, nearly 600 years after Jacques de Molay was actually arrested, which means the version of this story most people already carry in their heads, a secret order destroyed on history's own unluckiest day, is very likely a coincidence dressed up centuries later as an omen. What this evening actually has to offer you is a considerably stranger and considerably more human story than that same superstition suggests, because the destruction of the Knights Templar was not the work of any curse, any secret conspiracy uncovered, or any genuine crime the order had actually committed so far as the honest surviving evidence allows a modern historian to judge, but the calculated, patient and thoroughly cynical work of a king who owed an order of monks and knights more money than he could ever hope to repay, who needed a spectacular villain to distract a restless kingdom from a currency he had already debased twice in a single decade, and who discovered, in an institution that had spent nearly 200 years accumulating wealth, land and privilege across the whole of Christian Europe, for a war that had, by 1307, already been lost, an almost perfectly undefended target sworn to obedience scattered across a continent in small isolated garrisons with no standing army left to protect them, and holding in its own vaults and account books exactly the kind of fortune a desperate monarch could use. Tonight is the story of how 8 or 9 impoverished knights guarding a pilgrim road became the wealthiest and most feared military order in Christian history, of the 2 centuries of blood, discipline, and slowly accumulating fortune that carried them there, and of the single, carefully engineered morning in which nearly all of it, the discipline, the fortune, and the men themselves, was unmade. Before we drift any further into tonight's own long telling, take a quiet moment. If the story has earned it from you by this point to like this video and subscribe, though only for the honest reason that you find yourself genuinely wanting more evenings like this one, because that is truly the only reason I would ever ask it of you. This is still a small channel, sitting right around 1,000 subscribers as this particular story goes out into the world, and if the slow, unhurried way we tell these stories is genuinely the kind of thing you find yourself returning to, then helping this small channel find its own way toward 10,000 subscribers would mean considerably more to its future than you probably realise sitting there listening tonight. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube, the Spotify link for this same channel is waiting for you down in the description, since new episodes have lately taken to landing there just a little before they reach this screen. And if you are listening on Spotify right now instead, searching Historian at midnight over on YouTube will show you the rest of what this channel has quietly been building. And if the mood takes you, leave your own city and your own local time down in the comments, because it costs you nothing at all, and it lets other restless, sleepless people find their way here. And there is something quietly good about knowing that somewhere out there tonight, under some entirely different stretch of sky, another stranger is settling into this exact same slow hour. There is no need to hurry toward any part of what follows tonight, so let your shoulders find whatever is holding them up right now and stop asking anything more of them. Let your breathing slow to whatever pace it wants to find on its own, and let your eyes close whenever they are ready to. Because none of what follows needs watching, only listening. The way you might listen to a fire settling in another room, long after everyone else in the house has already gone to sleep. 9 tired knights once slept on borrowed floors in a foreign city, owning between them, by one persistent old account, only a single warhorse for every 2 men, and inside 200 years that same threadbare brotherhood had grown rich enough and feared enough that a king of France needed an army of soldiers and a forest of sealed parchments just to bring it down in a single morning. And if a story that large can still be told slowly enough to fall asleep to, then whatever is sitting on your own chest tonight can almost certainly be set down for a few hours too. To understand how 9 landless knights ever came to matter enough for a king to fear them, we have to go back further still, to the last days of a war that had already, by the time our own story properly begins, reshaped the map of the Near East and left the whole of Western Christendom half convinced that God himself had taken a direct and personal hand in its outcome. In the year 1095, at a church council held in the French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon calling on the knights of Western Europe to march east and reclaim the city of Jerusalem from Muslim rule, a call that produced, across the following 4 years, one of the strangest and most consequential military movements the medieval world would ever see. Tens of thousands of soldiers, minor nobles, peasants, and outright opportunists marching some 2,000 miles overland toward a city almost none of them had ever seen, suffering losses along the way from disease, starvation, and battle that modern historians estimate carried off a genuinely staggering proportion of everyone who set out, and arriving in June of 1099 at the walls of Jerusalem itself with an army reduced by some estimates to barely more than 1/10 of its original size. The city fell on the 15th of July that same year, taken by assault after a siege of a little more than 5 weeks, and what followed inside its own walls, a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish population, carried out with a thoroughness and a religious fervour that shocked even some of the Crusaders' own chroniclers writing shortly afterward, stands as one of the darker opening chapters of the whole Crusader project. A slaughter later Christian writers would try, with varying degrees of honesty, to minimise or explain away, and one this evening will return to weigh honestly in its own proper place rather than pass over now. Out of that same bloody conquest rose a new and genuinely improvised Christian state, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled first by a nobleman named Godfrey of Bouillon, who declined the title of king himself and took instead the more modest title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, and then, within a year of Godfrey's own death, by his brother Baldwin, who accepted the crown Godfrey had refused and became, in the year 1100, the first king to formally rule Jerusalem as a Christian monarch since the 7th century. The kingdom this same conquest produced was, from its very first years, a state built on almost impossibly thin foundations, a narrow strip of conquered territory running down the eastern Mediterranean coast, populated overwhelmingly by Muslim, Jewish and native Christian communities who had not chosen this new government, and in most cases deeply resented it, defended by a permanent garrison of Western Knights that never, across the whole of the kingdom's nearly 200-year existence, numbered more than a few thousand men at any single time, and surrounded, in every direction beyond its own thin coastal strip, by a Muslim world considerably larger, considerably wealthier, and considerably more populous than the fragile Christian territory that had so improbably carved itself out of the middle of it. That new kingdom immediately produced a single, specific, and genuinely dangerous problem, because word of the conquest of Jerusalem and of the new possibility it created for ordinary Christians to complete the pilgrimage of a lifetime to the actual sites of Christ's own life and death spread quickly across the whole of Western Europe, and pilgrims, unarmed, largely ignorant of the terrain, and travelling in numbers that could run into the thousands during the busiest seasons of the year, began making the long and genuinely perilous journey from the port cities of the Levantine coast up into the interior toward Jerusalem itself, along roads that ran through hill country, narrow mountain passes, and stretches of open desert where bandits, local raiders, and the simple hostility of a population that had recently watched its own cities sacked found an easy and reliably profitable target, a danger vivid enough that one surviving contemporary account describes a single incident in which several hundred pilgrims making the short journey between the coastal city of Jaffa and Jerusalem were ambushed and killed in a single attack. Their bodies, by that same account, left along the roadside long enough that later travellers on the same route had to pass directly among them. It was into precisely that gap, an under-defended kingdom, a growing flood of unarmed pilgrims, and roads that had become, in the plainest possible sense, killing grounds, that a French knight named Hugh of Paynes stepped, sometime around the year 1119, with a proposal that was, by the standards of anything the medieval church had yet formally sanctioned, genuinely radical. Hugh of Paynes came from the region of Champagne in northeastern France, a region that would go on, through several of the specific men and specific patrons this evening will introduce shortly, to matter to the Templars' own early history considerably more than its modest size might suggest, and he arrived in the Holy Land by most modern reconstructions of a genuinely thin and contested early record, either as a participant in the First Crusade itself or in one of the smaller waves of reinforcement that followed it over the next 2 decades. A knight, by every surviving account, of real piety and real seriousness, watching the same roadside slaughter this evening as just described and arriving, together with a small handful of like-minded companions, at an idea the church itself had never quite dared to formally bless before, a permanent order of knights, bound by the same vows of poverty, chastity and obedience that governed a monk in any ordinary monastery, but armed, trained, and explicitly authorized to kill in defense of Christian pilgrims, rather than to withdraw from the world entirely. That same idea would have sounded genuinely strange to most churchmen of the age, because the whole weight of centuries of Christian moral teaching up to this point had treated the taking of human life, even in a just war, as something requiring penance afterward, a regrettable necessity rather than a positive good, and a knight who killed in battle, however justified the cause, was still expected in the ordinary theology of the age to confess that killing is a sin requiring absolution, which made the specific fusion Hugh of Paynes was proposing. A man who was simultaneously a monk under permanent vows and a soldier permitted, even expected, to kill as part of his own sworn religious duty, something close to a genuine theological innovation, one that would need a churchman of real stature and real persuasive power to make it respectable. And it is exactly that same churchman this evening will introduce properly a little further along into Knight's own telling. According to the tradition later Templar and church writers preserved, though one modern historians have found reason to treat with the same careful scepticism, this evening has already applied to several other founding legends along the way. Hugh of Paynes approached Baldwin II, who had by this point succeeded his cousin as King of Jerusalem, with a proposal to found a new order dedicated specifically to protecting pilgrims on the roads leading into the city, and Baldwin II, whose own small kingdom badly needed exactly this kind of unpaid, self-funding security force, and had neither the manpower nor the treasury to provide one from its own resources, agreed and granted the new order lodging inside the royal palace itself, a building constructed in a much earlier era, on or near the site of the ancient Jewish temple that had once stood in Jerusalem before its destruction by Roman forces in the year 70 after Christ, and that Crusader tradition, somewhat confusingly to a modern ear, had come to identify with the biblical Temple of Solomon. That specific royal grant placed the new order's headquarters somewhere worth naming precisely, because the building in question was, more exactly, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a major Islamic holy site standing on the elevated platform known to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, and to Jews as the Temple Mount, a building the Crusaders, following the city's capture in 1099, had converted into a royal residence, and, in places, a stable, and it was from this same specific building, the Templum Domini as some contemporary Latin sources called the whole complex, that Hugh of Paynes and his small original band of knights took the name history would remember them by, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name later shortened, in the everyday speech of the period and in nearly every account since, to simply the Knights Templar, or, more plainly still, the Templars. Examined honestly, the earliest years of that same new order were threadbare and genuinely marginal, because the whole surviving tradition agrees that the original founding company numbered somewhere between 8 and 9 knights, a number small enough that one enduring and vivid piece of early Templar iconography, a seal used by the order in its own later considerably wealthier years, showed 2 knights mounted together on a single horse, an image later legend explained, not entirely convincingly, as a deliberate symbol of humility and shared poverty, but one that at least a few modern historians suspect may simply have reflected the plain, unglamorous fact that in the order's earliest years there were not nearly enough horses or enough money to buy them to go around. 9 knights guarding roads that stretched for dozens of miles through country. A single small band of that size could not possibly have patrolled with any real effectiveness. Sustained for their first several years by nothing more than whatever charity individual pilgrims, local clergy, and the King of Jerusalem himself chose to offer them, a beginning so modest that it would take the direct sustained intervention of one of the single most influential churchmen of the entire 12th century before this same fragile experiment turned into anything resembling the institution history actually remembers. That churchman was a Cistercian abbot named Bernard of Clairvaux, and it is genuinely difficult to overstate how much weight a single endorsement from this one man carried in the Christian Europe of the 1120s, because Bernard was, by this point in his own career, already the most celebrated preacher, the most prolific letter writer, and very nearly the most politically influential churchman on the entire continent. A man popes consulted, kings feared crossing, and ordinary believers travelled considerable distances simply to hear speak, and he happened, through the specific accident of family connection, this evening's earlier mention of Champagne was quietly setting up to be the nephew of one of Hugh of Paynes's own original companions, a family tie that gave the new and still entirely unofficial order of knight monks in Jerusalem a direct personal channel to the single man in Western Christendom best positioned to make their strange and theologically uncomfortable project respectable. Picture, for a moment, the specific gathering at which that same respectability was formally granted, because in January of 1129, a church council convened in the French town of Troyes, in Bernard's own home region of Champagne, with the specific purpose of examining Hugh of Paynes's small band of pilgrim guards and deciding whether the church could and should formally recognise them as a legitimate religious order. Hugh of Paynes himself travelling back from Jerusalem to attend in person, and the council, presided over by a papal legate and attended by a considerable gathering of archbishops, bishops and abbots, including Bernard himself, who by most modern reconstructions of the surviving record played a decisive behind-the-scenes role in shaping its outcome, formally approved a rule for the new order, a lengthy document, 72 clauses in its earliest surviving form, governing everything from how many horses a knight brother was permitted to keep, to how often the brothers were required to eat meat, to the precise liturgical hours at which prayers were to be said, even in the middle of active military campaigns, a document that took the ordinary structure of Cistercian monastic life, the same tradition Bernard's own abbey at Clairvaux followed, and grafted onto it, clause by careful clause, the specific practical demands of men who would spend as much of their lives on horseback and in battle as they spent in a chapel. Bernard produced, in the years immediately following that same council, a specific and genuinely remarkable piece of writing, a short treatise addressed directly to Hugh of Paynes and his brothers, titled, in its Latin original, De Laude Novae Militiae, or In Praise of the New Knighthood, because in it Bernard set out, with the same rhetorical force that had already made him the most sought-after preacher in Europe, the specific theological argument that made the whole Templar project possible in the first place, a distinction he drew, carefully and deliberately, between what he called homicide, the sinful killing of a man, and what he termed malicide, the righteous destruction of evil itself using a human body as its instrument, arguing that a knight of the new order who killed a Muslim enemy in defence of Christian pilgrims was not committing a sin requiring penance at all, but performing something closer to an act of divine service, since the enemy killed, in Bernard's own framing, represented not a human soul deserving of Christian mercy, but evil made temporarily flesh. An argument modern readers, examining it with the considerable benefit of 9 intervening centuries of moral reflection, tend to find at minimum deeply troubling and at maximum a fairly naked piece of religious propaganda constructed to serve an already decided political and military purpose, but one that landed, in the Europe of 1130, with tremendous and immediate force, because it gave a restless generation of younger sons, men raised in a knightly warrior culture with no land of their own to inherit, and no legitimate outlet for the violence their whole upbringing had trained into them, a genuinely respectable and genuinely holy channel for exactly that violence, one that promised, in Bernard's own vivid phrase, that a knight of Christ could kill in perfect safety and die with even greater safety still, secure both for himself when he metes out death, and yet more secure when he himself is put to death. That same theological blessing translated quickly into concrete material support, because Bernard did not simply write a persuasive pamphlet and move on to other concerns. He actively lobbied, in letters that survive to this day, on the new order's behalf among the nobility of France and Flanders, and the response across the following 2 decades was extraordinary. Land grants, cash donations, and entire manor houses were signed over to the Templars by pious nobles across Western Europe eager to associate themselves and their own families' souls with an order Bernard of Clairvaux himself had personally vouched for, and it was out of this same wave of donated property that the Templars began building what would eventually become one of the most sophisticated logistical and financial networks the medieval world had ever seen, a network of local houses called commanderies or preceptories, scattered within little more than a generation of the Council of Troy across France, England, Scotland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the German lands, each one a working farm, estate, or urban property that generated income, recruited new members, and funneled a share of its own revenue eastward to support the Order's actual military operations in the Holy Land. A rear echelon of European wealth quietly supporting a thin, embattled front line of knights. Most of the donors themselves would never travel far enough to actually see an action. The Order adopted, during these same early decades, a specific and genuinely distinctive appearance, because the plain white mantle that became the single most recognisable symbol of the Templars, and that Bernard's own Cistercian order also wore as a mark of monastic purity and renunciation, was formally granted to the Knight brothers by the Council of Troyes itself, a visual statement of chastity and simplicity meant to set them apart from the more brightly dressed secular knighthood of the period. And it was not until nearly 2 decades later, in 1147, that Pope Eugenius III, who had once been a monk under Bernard's own direction at Clairvaux before rising to the papacy, formally granted the order the right to sew a red cross onto the left breast of that same white mantle. A cross Templar tradition held was meant to remind every brother who wore it that martyrdom, a red death in defence of the faith, was always a live possibility, waiting somewhere ahead of him on campaign. And it was under that same combination, white cloth and red cross, riding beneath a black and white banner the order called the Beauseant, that Templar knights would fight, and very often die, across the whole of the following century and a half. This same rapidly growing order settled, as it matured beyond its original handful of founding knights, into a far more complex internal structure than its early years might suggest, because the Templars were never, even at the height of their later wealth and fame, purely an order of knights in the narrow sense, the fighting knight brothers themselves, drawn exclusively from the ranks of the European nobility, since only a man who could already afford his own horse, arms and armour, before joining was eligible to take the Order's knightly vows, made up in fact only a minority of the Order's total membership, supported by a considerably larger body of sergeant brothers, non-noble men who served as lighter cavalry, infantry, craftsmen and administrators, and who wore a black or brown mantle rather than the knight's distinctive white, by a body of chaplain brothers, ordained priests who lived under the Order's own rule, and administered its sacraments so that a dying Templar on campaign never had to rely on outside clergy for last rites, and by an even larger supporting population of non-combatant staff, farmers, craftsmen, and hired local auxiliaries called turcopoles, lightly armed cavalry recruited from among local Christian and even mixed parentage populations who knew the terrain and the tactics of the region's Muslim armies far better than any knight freshly arrived from France or England ever could. The whole structure commanded at its very top by a Grand Master, elected for life by the Order's senior officers, assisted by a seneschal who served as his second in command, a marshal who oversaw military equipment and discipline in the field, and a network of regional commanders called preceptors who governed the Order's provinces across Europe and the Levant with a degree of practical independence that would, this evening will show you later, occasionally bring the Order into open and uncomfortable conflict with the very kings and bishops whose own territory those provinces sat inside. A great deal changed for a man the day he formally entered the Order, both what he gave up and what he received in exchange, because the ceremony of admission the rule laid out was deliberately searching and deliberately blunt. A prospective brother was asked, before witnesses, whether he had a wife or was betrothed to one, since marriage was incompatible with the Order's vow of chastity, whether he owed debts he could not repay, since a man joining simply to escape his creditors was considered to be entering under false pretences, and whether he had made any secret promise to join another order already, and having answered honestly, he then surrendered permanently and without any right of return, whatever personal property he owned, his horses, his arms, and any land or income he held in the outside world, all of it passing into the collective ownership of the Order itself, in exchange for which he received his mantle, his horse and equipment reissued to him now as the Order's own property rather than his, a fixed and modest daily allowance of food, and a promise, considerably more binding in practice than in the ordinary secular world he had just left, that he would eat, sleep, fight, and very likely die exactly where and when his superiors in the order commanded him to. A genuinely severe bargain, poverty and permanent obedience traded for spiritual purpose, and a share in a collective enterprise considerably larger and considerably longer lived than any single man's own ambitions. And it is worth adding, honestly, that more than a few men who took this exact bargain did so not out of pure youthful zeal, but as a form of penance imposed on them later in life. Older knights who had committed some serious sin in their secular career, and were sentenced, by a bishop or by their own conscience, to spend their remaining years in the order's service as a kind of living atonement, which meant the ranks of the Templars, examined honestly rather than romantically, always included a meaningful mixture of genuine youthful idealists, and considerably more weathered men working off debts of an entirely different kind than the financial ones the admission ceremony asked about. Picture for a moment exactly what an ordinary day actually looked and sounded like for one of these newly admitted brothers, because the rule the Council of Troyes had approved governed nearly every waking hour, with a specificity that left remarkably little room for personal choice. Brothers rose before dawn for the first of a fixed cycle of prayers recited at set hours throughout the day and night. Matins, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers and compline. The same liturgical rhythm any Cistercian monk under Bernard's own direction would have followed. Meals were taken together in silence, broken only by a brother reading aloud from Scripture while the others ate. Meat permitted 3 times a week and forbidden on the remaining days in accordance with ordinary monastic fasting practice, and brothers slept whenever campaign conditions allowed it, in a communal dormitory with a lamp left burning through the night, and their shirts and breeches kept on rather than removed. A small practical detail the rule specifies directly, so that a brother roused by a sudden alarm could be armed and mounted within minutes, rather than left fumbling for clothing in the dark while an enemy raiding party closed on the camp. The rule forbade a great many of the ordinary pleasures a secular knight of the same rank would have taken for granted. Hunting and hawking were banned outright except for the hunting of lions, an exception the rule justifies in language borrowing directly from Scripture's own image of the lion as a symbol of the devil roaming the earth seeking prey. Games of chance were forbidden, and a brother's hair was to be kept cropped short in the manner of a monk, while his beard, in a detail that gave the Templars much of their own distinctive and slightly fearsome visual appearance in contemporary art, was to be left entirely unshaven and allowed to grow long. A visible mark, the rule's own text suggests, of a man who had set aside ordinary vanity along with everything else he had surrendered on the day he took his vows. A single legal document turned this rapidly expanding order from a merely popular cause into something closer to a state within a state, because in 1139 Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull known by its opening Latin words, Omni Datum Optimum, every good gift, granting the Templars a bundle of privileges and exemptions considerably more sweeping than almost any other religious institution in Christendom possessed. The order was declared answerable to the Pope alone rather than to any local bishop, meaning a Templar preceptor could refuse a bishop's own instructions with the full backing of Rome behind him. The order was permitted to keep its own priests and chaplains rather than relying on local clergy. It was exempted from paying tithes on its own agricultural produce, while simultaneously being permitted to collect tithes of its own from certain properties, and, in a clause that would matter a great deal to this evening's later story, it was granted the right to keep any plunder taken from Muslim armies in battle, rather than surrendering a customary share to the local Christian ruler, under whose banner it happened to be fighting. A bundle of privileges that made the Templars, within little more than 2 decades of 9 knights sharing a single horse, one of the most legally independent institutions in the whole of Western Christendom, answerable in any meaningful practical sense to no one but their own Grand Master, and at a considerable distance the Pope himself. That same independence, combined with the flood of donated European land this evening as already described, allowed the order to build something the medieval world had rarely seen organised on this scale, because the Templars discovered, somewhere across the middle decades of the 12th century, that the very same infrastructure they had assembled to move men, horses and supplies safely across a continent for their own military purposes could be adapted with only modest additional effort into something the medieval world had never quite seen organised on this particular scale before, a functioning international banking network. A nobleman or a wealthy pilgrim preparing to travel from, say, London or Paris to Jerusalem faced a genuine and dangerous practical problem. Carrying enough gold and silver coin to fund a journey of many months through robber-infested territory was itself an invitation to exactly the kind of roadside violence this evening's opening has already described, and the Templars offered a solution. A traveller could deposit a sum of money at a Templar house in his own home country, receive in exchange a sealed letter of credit recording that deposit, carry that considerably less tempting piece of parchment across the whole of the journey east, and present it at a Templar house near his own destination to withdraw an equivalent sum in local currency, an early and genuinely sophisticated form of the same basic principle underlying a modern traveller's cheque or letter of credit, built on a network of fortified, well-guarded houses spread across 2 continents, and held together by a shared chain of command and a shared set of financial records that made fraud considerably harder to get away with than it would have been dealing with any single local moneylender. That same financial role eventually extended far beyond simple pilgrim banking, because the Temple in Paris, the Order's great fortified headquarters on the eastern edge of the French capital that this evening's own opening scene has already described, grew, across the 12th and 13th centuries, into something considerably closer to the unofficial royal treasury of the Kingdom of France itself. French kings deposited crown revenue there, borrowed from the Order to fund wars and ransoms, and used Templar officials as financial administrators to manage royal accounts, a degree of trust and practical entanglement between the French crown and the Templar Order that makes the events this evening's opening has already described a king of France arresting the very institution that had spent generations managing his own family's money, read, on reflection, considerably less like a bolt from a clear sky and considerably more like the final brutal turn of a relationship that had been growing steadily more dependent and steadily more resentful for well over a century. And it is worth adding here, plainly, one further specific detail this evening will return to at its own proper moment much later on, that during a violent popular uprising in Paris in the early 1300s sparked by one of Philip IV's own currency devaluations, the king himself, unable to guarantee his own safety inside his own royal palace, took refuge for several days inside the fortified walls of the Paris Temple, sheltered, ironically enough, by the very Order whose own wealth he would move to seize only a few years later. The Order's economic footprint reached well beyond banking and battlefield plunder alone, because the commanderies scattered across rural Europe were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, functioning agricultural estates in their own right, running sheep farms in England, vineyards in France, and grain-producing manors across the German lands, worked by tenant farmers and hired labour under Templar management, generating a steady rural income that supplemental land donations and outright cash gifts only ever supplemented rather than replaced. While along the Mediterranean coast the Order maintained its own fleet of ships, based chiefly out of ports in southern France, and later out of the island of Cyprus, used to move men, horses and supplies between Europe and the Holy Land more securely than commercial shipping alone could guarantee, so that by the middle of the 13th century, the Knights Templar, an order whose entire founding purpose had been the humble protection of unarmed pilgrims on a few dozen miles of dangerous road, had become simultaneously one of the largest landowners in Western Europe, one of its most sophisticated financial institutions, and the standing military backbone of a small and permanently endangered kingdom fighting for its own survival on the far eastern edge of the Mediterranean world. Picture, for a moment, what all of this actually meant for one specific and entirely ordinary traveller, reconstructed honestly from the general pattern, the surviving Templar financial records and pilgrim accounts of the period allow, rather than from any single named individual's own diary, an English wool merchant say, or a modest Flemish widow fulfilling a vow made during some earlier illness, arriving at a Templar commandery outside London sometime in the early 1180s, with a sum of silver too large and too dangerous to simply carry loose across 2,000 miles of foreign road, handing that silver over to a sergeant brother trained in exactly this kind of transaction, watching him weigh it, record it in a ledger, and hand back a single sealed piece of parchment in its place, and then setting out, considerably lighter and considerably less tempting a target for the next bandit or corrupt toll-keeper along the way, through France, over the Alps, or down through Italy, by ship across the Mediterranean, and finally up the dusty coastal road toward Jerusalem itself, presenting that same worn and much-handled parchment, months later, at a Templar house within sight of the city walls, and receiving back a sum in local currency that let her, or him, complete the pilgrimage without ever once carrying enough visible wealth to be worth killing for along the way, an entirely unremarkable transaction of exactly the kind the Templars processed by the thousands across 2 centuries, leaving behind, in the overwhelming majority of cases, no name, no diary entry, and no trace in any surviving record beyond a single anonymous line in a commandery's own account book, the plain, unglamorous, and almost entirely unrecorded human traffic that the Order's own famous military reputation was originally built to protect in the first place. It would be a mistake, though, to let that same picture of steady, well-managed growth stand entirely unchallenged, because the Templars own considerable independence, the very privilege that had made their rapid rise possible in the first place, also produced, on more than one occasion across these same decades, genuine friction with the local authority of the kingdom the Order was sworn to defend, and it is worth naming honestly the single most notorious early example of exactly that friction. An incident from the year 1173 involving a Templar Grand Master named Odo de Saint-Amand. In that year, King Amalric of Jerusalem had been carefully negotiating an alliance with the Assassins, a secretive Ismaili sect based in the mountains of Syria, whose own leader had sent envoys to the royal court proposing friendship, and even, by some accounts, conversion to Christianity in exchange for relief from an annual tribute the Order paid to the Templars themselves, a diplomatic opening Amalric considered valuable enough to guarantee the returning envoys safe passage under his own royal protection, and a Templar knight named Walter du Mesnil, acting, so far as the surviving record allows anyone to judge, entirely on his own initiative, or at most on orders from within the Order, rather than from the Crown, ambushed and murdered the assassin envoys on their journey home, an act that violated the king's own explicit guarantee of safe conduct, and threatened to unravel a diplomatic arrangement Amalric had invested real effort in building. When the furious king demanded that Grandmaster Odo de Saint-Amand hand the killer over for royal justice, Odo refused outright, informing Amalric that Walter de Menel was a member of the Templar Order, and therefore answerable only to the Pope and to his own Grand Master, precisely the sweeping legal independence Omni Datum Optimum had granted the Order decades earlier, and Amalric, unable to compel obedience from an institution that answered to Rome rather than to Jerusalem, was reduced to riding personally to the Templar house at Sidon, seizing Walter du Mesnil by force and imprisoning him himself, a small but genuinely telling episode that shows, in miniature, exactly the kind of tension a militarized order legally accountable to nobody inside the kingdom it operated in could produce. Useful, disciplined, and effectively indispensable to the kingdom's own defence in one moment, and a law unto itself, answerable to no local authority at all, in the very next. The Order's growing wealth was being spent across these same decades on something specific, because alongside the commanderies and farms scattered across Europe, the Templars poured a considerable share of their own resources into building and garrisoning an entire network of massive stone fortresses along the frontiers of the Crusader states, castles built not for comfort or display, but for the specific grim purpose of holding a strategic pass, a river crossing, or a stretch of vulnerable coastline against an enemy who could, at almost any given moment, field considerably larger numbers than the Christian kingdoms ever could. The great Templar fortress of Bagorus, perched high in the Amanus Mountains guarding the approach into the Principality of Antioch, the castle of Tortosa on the Syrian coast, whose own surviving chapel remains standing to this day as one of the best preserved pieces of Templar architecture anywhere in the world. Chastel Blanc, a short distance inland, its keep still visible on its own hilltop, the mountain fortress of Saft in Galilee, rebuilt and massively expanded by the Templars in the 1140s, at a cost so enormous that surviving Templar financial records describe pouring the equivalent of a small kingdom's annual revenue into its walls and garrison, an atlet known to the Crusaders as Chateau Pèlerin, the pilgrims' castle, built on a rocky coastal promontory so naturally defensible that when it finally fell into Muslim hands many decades later, it did so only because its own garrison abandoned it voluntarily rather than because any army had actually managed to breach its walls by force. Together, these fortresses formed a defensive spine holding together a kingdom that could never, on manpower alone, have hoped to match its neighbours in the open field. A strategy of stone and discipline substituting, wherever it possibly could, for the sheer weight of numbers the Christian states never had. To understand the specific kind of discipline those same fortresses depended on, and the specific kind of battlefield reputation the Templars built across these same decades, we have to look at the Order's actual conduct in the field, because the rule that governed the Templars in camp and on campaign was, by the standards of 12th century warfare, extraordinarily strict. A Templar knight who fled the battlefield without his commander's explicit order, or who charged into the enemy without waiting for the signal to do so, could be formally expelled from the Order for cowardice or for reckless disobedience alike, since an undisciplined charge that broke a Templar formation's own cohesion was judged, under the Order's own military logic, nearly as dangerous to the whole army as outright flight. And it was precisely this same reputation for iron discipline, for holding a line and for never surrendering while any hope of relief remained, that made the small number of Templar knights present on any given medieval battlefield, rarely more than a few hundred even in the largest Crusader armies the Kingdom of Jerusalem ever fielded, disproportionately valuable. Unit commanders on both sides of these wars had learned, by hard experience, to take with genuine seriousness regardless of its actual numbers. The black and white Beauseant banner this evening, as already named, was itself woven directly into that same discipline, because Templar military custom treated the banner as the single fixed point around which an entire engagement was organised. A knight was forbidden to charge until the banner itself moved forward, and if the banner fell, a designated group of knights was specifically tasked with nothing else but raising it again immediately, since a fallen and unrecovered banner signalled to friend and enemy alike that the unit's own command structure had collapsed, and a scattered Templar contingent that lost sight of its own banner in the chaos of battle was instructed by the rule itself to rally instead to the nearest banner of any Christian order, rather than break formation looking for its own, a small tactical detail that captures, better than almost anything else in the Order's own military code, exactly how thoroughly the Templars had engineered plain, disciplined cohesion into every visible symbol they carried into the field. That same discipline, and that same willingness to fight to the last man rather than surrender, was tested on a genuinely brutal scale during the Second Crusade. The great expedition launched in 1147, after the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa to a Muslim general named Zengi 2 years earlier, had sent shockwaves back through Western Christendom, and prompted Bernard of Clairvaux himself, the same churchman whose theological arguments had made the Templar order possible in the first place, to preach a new crusade with the same fiery, persuasive energy he had once devoted to defending Hugh of Pains's small band of knights. The Templars accompanied the army of King Louis VII of France on its own overland march through Anatolia, and it was during that same march, after the crusading host had already suffered devastating losses to a Turkish ambush at Mount Cadmus, and found its own discipline and morale badly shaken, that Louis, on the advice of his own commanders, formally placed the entire army, French nobility and common soldiers alike under the direct battlefield command of the Templar master Everard des Bas for the remainder of the march to the coast. A genuinely remarkable concession from a reigning king of France to a religious order's own field commander, and one that speaks plainly to exactly how far the Templars' battlefield reputation had already travelled within less than 30 years of 9 knights sharing a single horse. Everard reorganising the shattered column into smaller, tightly disciplined units, each anchored by a handful of Templar knights, a reform later chroniclers credit with getting what remained of the army safely through the rest of its journey to the Anatolian coast in considerably better order than it would otherwise have managed. The Second Crusade itself, once its surviving remnant finally reached the Holy Land, ended in a considerably less creditable episode, a badly planned and swiftly abandoned siege of the Muslim city of Damascus in the summer of 1148 that collapsed within days, amid recriminations, rumours of bribery among the Crusader leadership that modern historians treat with real scepticism, and a hasty retreat that left the whole expensive, heavily preached expedition ending in humiliation rather than triumph. But the Templars themselves emerged from the whole affair with their own individual reputation, if anything, enhanced rather than diminished, a pattern that would repeat itself across the following decades, entire crusading expeditions ending in failure, recrimination, or outright disaster, while the Templars, judged specifically on their own battlefield conduct rather than on the strategic wisdom of the commanders who led them there, continued to be regarded by friend and enemy alike as the single most reliable fighting force the Crusader states could put into the field. This same reputation for discipline did not always translate into good judgment at the highest levels of the Order's own leadership, and nowhere would that gap between battlefield courage and strategic wisdom matter more than in the final catastrophic decade of the kingdom the Templars had spent nearly 70 years helping to defend. By the 1180s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had fallen under the rule of a young king named Baldwin IV, a genuinely capable and genuinely tragic figure afflicted, from adolescence, with leprosy, a disease that would slowly rob him of his own sight, his own limbs, and eventually his own life, while he continued with a determination later chroniclers found genuinely remarkable, to lead his kingdom's armies in person for as long as his failing body physically allowed him to, and it was during Baldwin's own troubled and increasingly uncertain reign, one this evening will not retrace in the fuller detail it genuinely deserves, that the kingdom's own succession problem, who would actually rule once the leper king's own body finally failed him, grew into the specific crisis that would determine everything that followed. Baldwin, unable to father an heir of his own, had settled the succession on his young nephew, a boy who died within a year of briefly inheriting the crown, and the throne passed instead, amid open and increasingly bitter factional dispute among the kingdom's own leading nobles, to Baldwin's own sister Sibylla, who chose, over the loud objection of a considerable faction led by Raymond of Tripoli himself, to share that same crown with her own husband, a comparatively minor French nobleman of no great reputation named Guy of Lusignan, an outcome Raymond and his own allies regarded as a genuine catastrophe for the kingdom's own security, believing Guy simply lacked the experience and the personal authority to hold together a fractious nobility in the face of Saladin's own growing power, a judgment about Guy's own fitness for the crown that the following summer's events at Hattin would do very little to disprove, and it was into precisely this atmosphere of open, aristocratic distrust toward its own newly crowned king that Gerard de Riedfort's own personal grudge against Raymond found its most dangerous possible audience, a king who desperately needed to prove his own decisiveness to nobles who already doubted him, and a Templar Grand Master, his own personal grievances and own strategic judgment about to help carry the kingdom directly into ruin, only too willing to tell him exactly what he wanted to hear. That man was Gerard de Riedfort, a knight of Flemish origin who had arrived in the Holy Land some years earlier, nursing a bitter personal grudge against a powerful nobleman named Raymond of Tripoli, a grudge born, according to the surviving accounts, out of a broken promise. Raymond having pledged Gerard the hand of a wealthy heiress in marriage, a match that would have brought Gerard considerable land and income, only to renege on that same promise and marry the heiress instead to a rival Italian merchant able to outbid Gerard's own more modest offer. A personal humiliation Gerard is said to have never forgiven, and one that, entering the Templar Order shortly afterward and rising with real speed through its ranks until his election as Grand Master in 1184, he carried with him directly into the highest councils of a kingdom whose own survival would soon depend on exactly the kind of clear-headed cooperation between its leading men that Gerard's own long-nursed resentment made considerably harder to achieve. That same personal animosity produced its first genuinely disastrous taste of what it could do on an actual battlefield, an engagement fought in May of 1187 at a place called the Springs of Cresson, a small but strategically important water source in Galilee, because Raymond of Tripoli, attempting, in the kingdom's own uncertain and factionalised final years, to maintain a fragile local truce with the great Muslim commander Saladin, had granted a large raiding party under Saladin's own son safe passage through his own territory, a decision that struck Gerard de Riedefort, watching from nearby with a Templar and Hospitaller force considerably smaller than the raiding party it now proposed to confront, as an intolerable act of cowardice or outright collaboration, and Gerard, overruling the far more cautious advice of his own senior officers, ordered an immediate attack, riding out with somewhere in the range of 140 Templar and Hospitaller knights against a Muslim force numbering, by most surviving estimates, several thousand men, a charge that ended within minutes in one of the single most one-sided massacres the Templar Order would ever suffer. The Hospitaller Grand Master killed outright, the great majority of the Templar knights present killed alongside him, and Gerard de Riedefort himself among only a small handful of survivors who managed to escape the field alive, a disaster that should, by any ordinary standard of military accountability, have permanently discredited the man responsible for ordering it, and that instead, within a matter of weeks, found that same man standing at the very centre of the single, most consequential, and most catastrophic council of war the Kingdom of Jerusalem would ever hold. By the early summer of 1187, Saladin, who had spent the previous decade patiently uniting Egypt and Syria under his own single command, had assembled the largest Muslim army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had yet faced, and moved it against the Crusader states with the clear and deliberate intention of forcing a decisive battle, besieging the town of Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, a town whose own lady, Raymond of Tripoli's wife, remained trapped inside its walls even as Raymond himself rode to join the royal army, gathering at the springs of Saphuria to decide how to answer the threat. It was at that same council, King Guy of Lusignan presiding, that Raymond of Tripoli, the very man Gerard de Riedefort had never forgiven for the broken marriage promise of years before, argued forcefully, and, by the sober military logic of the situation, correctly, that the army should remain where it was, at Saphuria, a position with abundant water and secure supply lines, and let Saladin's own considerably larger force wear itself out, attempting to besiege a well-defended town rather than march the army out into the waterless hill country that lay between Saphuria and Tiberias in the full heat of a Levantine summer, advice Raymond gave, by more than one surviving account, despite his own wife remaining trapped inside the very town under siege, a genuinely striking piece of personal sacrifice offered in the name of sound strategy. Gerard de Riedefort's own council carried the day instead, because, still nursing the same grudge this evening as already described and apparently unable to hear sound strategic advice from Raymond's mouth, without suspecting treachery behind it, he argued the opposite case with equal and ultimately more persuasive force, accusing Raymond in front of the assembled council of caring more for his own wife and his own reputation than for the kingdom's survival, and warning Guy that a king already regarded by many of his own nobles as weak and indecisive could not afford to be seen doing nothing while a Christian town suffered siege within sight of his own gathered army, an argument that appealed directly to Guy's own considerable insecurity about his hold on a throne he had reached only by marriage, rather than by any battlefield reputation of his own. And Guy, overruling Raymond's own better judgment, gave the order that would doom the army, march at dawn for Tiberias, across some 15 miles of dry, broken hill country in the full heat of a Galilean July, with no reliable water source anywhere along the route. Picture, if you're still awake enough to want to, exactly what that same march actually looked like. Because the Crusader army, some 15 to 20,000 men including roughly 1,200 knights, of whom a considerable and disproportionately valuable share were the Templars and Hospitallers this evening has spent so long describing, set out from Sapphira on the 3rd of July under a sun that ancient and medieval accounts alike describe as punishing, even by the standards of a region accustomed to brutal summer heat, harassed from the very first hours of the march by Saladin's own light cavalry, who rode alongside the column firing arrows into its flanks, blocking access to what few wells and cisterns lay along the route, and setting fire in the march's final and most infamous hours to the dry summer scrub covering the hillsides the exhausted, thirst-maddened Crusader column was struggling across, a deliberate tactic that filled the army's own line of march with choking smoke on top of a heat and thirst, already pushing men and horses past the edge of what they could physically endure, the army finally grinding to a halt for the night on a stretch of high ground beneath twin hills known, from their distinctive shape, as the Horns of Hattin, still miles short of any reliable water, surrounded on every side by Saladin's own steadily tightening forces, and facing, as the sun rose the following morning, a battle most of the men fighting in it must already have understood, in whatever grim clarity thirst and exhaustion still allowed them, that they had very little real chance of winning. The battle that followed on the 4th of July 1187 was less a contest of manoeuvre than a slow, agonizing collapse. The Crusader infantry, driven half-mad by thirst and no longer capable of maintaining formation, broke first, streaming up the slope of the Horns of Hattin in a desperate, uncoordinated attempt to reach whatever relief the high ground seemed to promise, leaving the mounted knights, the last organised fighting force the kingdom possessed, to make a series of increasingly desperate and increasingly hopeless cavalry charges against Saladin's own encircling lines, charges the Templars and Hospitallers, true to the discipline this evening as already described at length, led from the very front Raymond of Tripoli himself, in one of the battle's genuinely strange final ironies, managing to break through the encircling Muslim line with a small mounted party in one of the day's opening charges, whether by his own design or, as some accounts suggest, because Saladin's own forces deliberately opened a gap to let the one Crusader leader who had counselled caution escape and carry word of the coming disaster back to the rest of Christendom, while King Guy, Gerard de Ridderfort, and the great mass of the remaining army fought on, in shrinking, increasingly desperate order, around the royal tent and the true cross itself, the actual relic Crusader tradition held to be a fragment of the cross of Christ's own crucifixion, carried into battle at the very heart of the army as its most sacred and most morale-sustaining possession, until, by the middle of the afternoon, resistance finally collapsed entirely. King Guy himself was taken prisoner along with Gerard de Ridderfort and a great many of the kingdom's surviving nobility. And the true cross itself, the single most sacred object the kingdom of Jerusalem possessed, was captured by Saladin's own forces and would never again be recovered by any Christian army. It is worth naming, plainly and without softening it, exactly what happened next to the captured Templar and Hospitaller knights specifically, because Saladin, who treated King Guy himself and the captured secular nobility with considerable personal courtesy, even offering Guy a cup of cooled water with his own hand, in a gesture later chroniclers on both sides of the conflict record with something close to admiration, drew a sharp and deliberate distinction when it came to the two military orders, regarding the Templars and Hospitallers specifically, correctly, as this evening's own account has already shown, as the single most dangerous and most irreconcilable fighting force in the whole of the Crusader states, an enemy that would never accept ransom, never abandon the fight, and never stop returning to the field so long as a single garrison remained standing, and Saladin therefore ordered the captured Templar and Hospitaller knights, numbering by most surviving accounts somewhere close to 200 men, executed, a mass killing his own court chroniclers describe him watching carried out personally by scholars and religious volunteers in his own camp rather than by professional soldiers, several accounts noting that some of the executions were performed clumsily and painfully by men unused to the work, a brutal end that Saladin, by the political and military logic of his own position, judged a necessary act of self-preservation rather than casual cruelty. Removing permanently from the field the one class of enemy fighter, he could never hope to simply ransom back into peaceful retirement, and it is worth adding to the specific and separate fate reserved for a nobleman named Raynald of Chatillon. A Crusader Lord Saladin had sworn a personal oath to kill with his own hand after years of Raynald's own raids on Muslim pilgrim caravans and merchant shipping, in violation of existing truces, an oath Saladin fulfilled, according to multiple surviving accounts, in his own tent that same evening, striking Raynald down personally after the captured lord refused an offer of conversion to Islam that might otherwise have spared his life, while Gerard de Riedefort himself, the very Templar Grand Master whose own personal grudge and own strategic misjudgment had done so much to bring the army to this exact field in the first place, was spared execution alongside his own knights, held instead for eventual ransom, a survival several later commentators, examining the wreckage his own decisions had helped produce, have found difficult to regard as any kind of mercy at all. The whole kingdom the Templars had spent nearly 70 years helping to defend collapsed with startling speed in the weeks that followed that single catastrophic afternoon, because with its field army destroyed and its most experienced military leadership either dead or in captivity, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had, in the most literal sense, no remaining force capable of defending its own cities, and town after town, garrison after garrison, surrendered to Saladin's advancing forces across the following months, with little or no resistance simply because there was no longer anyone left alive and free to offer any, culminating in October of that same year in the surrender of the city of Jerusalem itself, negotiated in a final small mercy history has generally credited to a nobleman named Balian of Ibelin, who organised what defence the city could still muster, on terms that allowed the city's Christian population to depart with their lives and a portion of their movable property, rather than face the kind of massacre the city's own Christian conquerors had inflicted on its Muslim and Jewish population 88 years earlier, a considerably more merciful outcome than the one this evening's own opening background section described the First Crusade producing, and one worth naming honestly, in the same spirit of even-handed judgment, this evening has tried to apply throughout, as a genuine point of moral credit to Saladin's own conduct, that a great many Christian chroniclers of the period, whatever else they said about him, felt obliged to record with something close to grudging admiration. Word of Hattin, and of Jerusalem's own fall, reached Western Europe within months, and produced there something close to a continent-wide spasm of grief and shame. A new crusade preached from pulpits across France, England, and the German lands, and an army eventually raised and led east by three of Europe's most powerful monarchs at once. The aging German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who would drown crossing a river in Anatolia before ever reaching the Holy Land, the cautious and calculating King Philip Augustus of France, and the considerably more famous English king Richard the Lionheart, whose own campaigns of 1191 and 1192, the recapture of the coastal city of Acre, the hard-fought and only narrowly won Battle of Arsuf, and the long, exhausting, ultimately unsuccessful march toward Jerusalem itself, twice bringing an army within sight of the city's own walls before judging on both occasions that it lacked the strength to hold what it might briefly capture, this evening will not walk through, in the same exhaustive detail a story centred specifically on Richard's own reign might give it. But one specific episode from that same campaign belongs directly inside the Templars' own story, and deserves telling here in full. In the course of sailing east to join the Crusade, Richard's own fleet was driven by storms to the island of Cyprus, where its ruler, a renegade Byzantine nobleman named Isaac Komnenos, who had declared himself independent emperor of the island some years earlier, treated Richard's own storm-battered ships and the noblewomen travelling aboard them, including Richard's own sister and his intended bride Berengaria of Navarre, with open hostility, an insult Richard answered by conquering the entire island within a matter of weeks, a swift and thoroughly one-sided campaign that left Richard holding, quite unexpectedly, an entire wealthy Mediterranean island he had no particular use for, and no intention of governing personally, while an actual crusade still waited to be fought on the mainland. And it was here that the Templars' own considerable financial resources made them, once again, an obvious and convenient solution to a problem that had nothing whatsoever to do with pilgrim roads or battlefield discipline. Richard selling the island to the Order for a substantial sum, a portion paid immediately, and the remainder secured against future revenue the island itself was expected to generate. That same purchase went badly for the Templars themselves, though, because the small Templar garrisons sent to actually govern Cyprus, a mere handful of knights attempting to extract taxation from a resentful Greek Cypriot population that had watched its own island change hands twice in the space of a single year, with no say in the matter at all, provoked, within months, an open revolt, an uprising serious enough that the small Templar garrison found itself under siege inside its own quarters in the island's capital, and was forced at real cost in men and prestige to fight its own way clear, a costly and genuinely humiliating experience that taught the Order's own leadership a lesson considerably outside their usual area of expertise, that governing a resentful conquered population was a fundamentally different kind of work than garrisoning a mountain pass or managing a pilgrim's bank deposit, and the Templars, having learned that lesson the hard way, asked Richard to take the island back, a request Richard granted, recovering Cyprus and then, rather than governing it directly himself, selling it a second time to Guy of Lusignan, the same deposed king of Jerusalem this evening's own account of Hattin has already introduced, a transaction that gave the man who had lost one kingdom on the mainland a considerably more durable one on the island instead, founding a Lusignan dynasty that would go on to rule Cyprus for close to 300 years, a small but genuinely telling episode in the Templars' own institutional history, proof that even an order with more disposable capital than almost any government in Christendom could, and occasionally did, make exactly the kind of overreaching purchase a wealthy man makes when the opportunity in front of him looks better than the practical difficulty of actually holding on to it. The ground beneath the whole Crusader project kept shifting thoroughly across the following century, because the 13th century that followed Richard's own partial and unsatisfying successes produced a long, uneven and increasingly discouraging sequence of further expeditions, a Fourth Crusade in 1204 that never even reached the Holy Land at all, diverting instead into the catastrophic sack of the Christian city of Constantinople, a Fifth Crusade in the 1220s that came startlingly close to trading the Egyptian port of Damietta for the return of Jerusalem itself, before its own leadership's poor judgment threw that advantage away, a Sixth Crusade in 1228 that recovered Jerusalem briefly and almost bloodlessly through the diplomacy of the excommunicated German Emperor Frederick II, rather than through any battle at all, only to lose the city again permanently within 15 years, and a Seventh Crusade, launched by the pious French King Louis IX in 1248, that ended in outright disaster in Egypt, Louis himself captured along with the greater part of his own army, and it was in the ransoming of that same captured king that the Templars once again found their own considerable financial machinery pressed into service at the very highest level, Louis's own advisors turning to the Order's treasury aboard ship to help assemble the enormous ransom his Egyptian captors demanded. And one small, sharply remembered episode from that same negotiation, a Templar treasurer initially refusing to release funds not explicitly designated for the king's own ransom, without proper authorization, forcing a furious royal official to threaten seizing the Order's own strongbox by force before the money was finally handed over, stands as a vivid reminder that even in the middle of a national emergency involving the king's own life, the Templars' own institutional habit of guarding their books and their procedures with real, sometimes maddening rigour did not simply switch itself off. By the second half of the 13th century, the whole Crusader project in the Holy Land had entered, by most contemporary observers' own admission, a long, slow and largely irreversible decline. The once broad band of Christian territory running down the eastern Mediterranean coast reduced, decade by decade, to an ever narrower and ever more fragmented string of coastal cities and isolated castles, while a new and considerably more formidable power rose to dominate the Muslim world in Saladin's own former territories, the Mamluk Sultanate, a state ruled by a military caste of former slave soldiers whose own sultans, men like Baybars and later Al-Ashraf Khalil, proved every bit as capable a military opponent as Saladin himself had been, and considerably less inclined toward the kind of chivalrous restraint chroniclers on both sides had occasionally credited Saladin with showing, systematically reducing the remaining Crusader strongholds one by one across the 12, 60s, 70s and 80s. Templar castles among them, Safed itself, the fortress This. Evening has already described the Order pouring a small fortune into rebuilding, falling to Baybars in 1266 after a siege that ended, according to the grim and disputed account that survives, with the garrison's surrender terms broken and its defenders killed despite an earlier promise of safe passage, until, by the final decade of the 13th century, only a small handful of Crusader possessions remained, chief among them the great fortified port city of Acre, the last major Christian stronghold left standing on the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, and the city where the whole 200-year Crusader project in the Holy Land would finally and permanently come to its own end. The siege that ended it began in April of 1291, when the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil marched on Acre with an army modern historians estimate at somewhere between 60 and 100,000 men, brought against a city defending itself with a garrison, drawn from the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the remaining forces of the Kingdom of Cyprus, and contingents of merchants and soldiers from the Italian trading cities of Venice, Pisa and Genoa, that on its very best day probably did not exceed 15 or 20,000 fighting men, a disproportion in numbers so severe that few observers on either side seriously expected the city to hold for long, and Acre's own double ring of walls and towers, reinforced over the previous century into one of the strongest fortifications anywhere on the Mediterranean coast, brought the defenders barely 6 weeks against a siege train of catapults and mining crews the Sultan had brought specifically to break exactly that kind of fortification down. Those final 6 weeks inside Acre's own walls, reconstructed honestly from the general pattern siege accounts of this period describe, rather than any single surviving eyewitness diary, would have felt like a slow, grinding suffocation to live through, because a city under continuous bombardment from more than 70 siege engines, a number several surviving Muslim accounts of the campaign specifically record the Sultan's own engineers deploying against Acre's walls, would have meant a near-constant low thunder of stone striking stone day and night, punctuated by the sharper, more specific crack of a section of wall or tower finally giving way, smoke from the mining fires the Mamluk sappers set beneath the foundations, mixing with the ordinary smoke of a crowded port city's own cooking fires and workshops, the streets themselves increasingly choked with refugees from the city's own outlying districts, pressing inward toward the harbour and the presumed safety of the fortified compound still standing, the specific rank smell of a besieged population's own overtaxed sanitation compounding in those final days, with the smell of the wounded and the dead accumulating faster than any burial detail could keep pace with, and above all of it, in the final desperate hours, the sound of ships' crews shouting for order at the Templar compound's own seagate, as the evacuation Peter de Sèvres organised tried, and mostly failed, to move a crowd of terrified refugees onto vessels that could never possibly have carried them all to safety in the time that remained. The city's own final days unfolded quickly once the walls finally gave, because by the middle of May, after weeks of continuous bombardment and repeated Mamluk mining operations that had already brought down several of the outer towers, the defenders' own field commanders recognised that the city itself could not much longer be held, and the Templar Grand Master, a man named Guillaume de Beaujeu, who had led the order for the better part of 2 decades, and had spent years before the final crisis trying without success to broker a survivable peace with the Sultan's own predecessor, took personal command of the defence of one of the city's most exposed sections of wall, and it was there, on the 18th of May, 1291, leading his own knights in the desperate close fighting of the city's final assault, that Guillaume de Beaujeu was struck by a crossbow bolt or a javelin in an unarmoured gap beneath his own raised arm, a wound his own men initially tried to hide from the rest of the garrison, for fear of the panic news of the Grand Master's fall would spread, carrying him back toward the Templar compound as he bled out, reportedly telling the men urging him to keep fighting that he could do no more, for he was dying, before succumbing to the wound within the day. A loss that removed, at the single worst possible moment, the one figure whose own authority might still have held the crumbling defence together. With the outer walls overrun and the city itself falling into chaos, the surviving defenders and a considerable portion of Acre's own civilian population, men, women and children desperate to escape a city everyone now understood was lost, fell back toward the harbour and toward the one structure in the whole city still capable of offering any real resistance, the great fortified Templar compound standing at the water's edge, a stone fortress within a fortress strong enough that even as the rest of Acre burned and fell around it, it continued holding out for close to 2 weeks after the rest of the city had already surrendered, its own walls sheltering by the final days a considerable crowd of refugees who had nowhere else left to run, and it was the Templar Marshal, a knight named Peter de Sévry, who took command of the compound's defence after Guillaume de Beaujeu's death, and organised, in the confusion of the city's collapse, what evacuation by sea he could manage, ships running a desperate shuttle between the Templar fortress's own seagate and the safety of Cyprus, carrying out as many of the trapped civilians and wounded as the available vessels could hold before the encircling Mamluk forces finally closed off even that last route. A specific and genuinely ugly episode brought the compound's own final negotiated surrender apart before it could be properly completed, because Peter de Sévry, recognising that the fortress could not hold indefinitely, and that a negotiated surrender offered the trapped refugees inside considerably better odds than a final assault, opened talks with the Sultan and secured terms allowing the garrison and the civilians sheltering with it safe passage out of the city, and a party of Mamluk soldiers was admitted into the compound to oversee the evacuation, only for a number of those same soldiers, amid the chaos of a fortress packed with frightened refugees, to begin assaulting the women and boys among the crowd, an outrage that provoked the Templar garrison, watching the terms of their own negotiated surrender violated in front of them, to turn on the Mamluk soldiers inside their own walls and kill them, an act that shattered whatever fragile trust the surrender negotiation had briefly established and left both sides convinced, from that moment on, that no further terms could be trusted. Peter de Sévry himself killed, according to differing accounts, either in the fighting that followed or after being lured out under a fresh promise of safe conduct that turned out to be as false as the last, and the remaining defenders, now without any realistic hope of survival, either by negotiated surrender or by continued resistance, chose to fight on regardless, until Mamluk sappers, working beneath the compound's own foundations in the final days, finally undermined its walls badly enough that the whole structure came down, by the surviving accounts, in a single catastrophic collapse that buried a number of the attacking Mamluk soldiers who had already forced their way inside alongside the last of the Templar defenders, still fighting among the rubble, a genuinely apocalyptic final image, an entire fortress pulling itself down on top of both its own last defenders and their attackers together rather than surrendering a second time. That marked, as clearly as any single moment in this whole 200-year story could, the actual physical end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The handful of Templar strongholds that still remained standing after Acre's own fall, chief among them the coastal castle at Sidon and the seemingly impregnable Chateau Pellerin at Atli this evening, has already named, held on for only a matter of weeks or months longer before their own garrisons, recognising that no relief would ever come, and that the whole mainland cause had been permanently lost, evacuated by sea rather than wait for a second version of the same siege that had just destroyed Acre, withdrawing to the island of Cyprus, the same island the Order had briefly and disastrously governed a century before, and it was from that same relatively modest island base, no longer the master of any mainland territory at all, that the Knights Templar, an order founded specifically and exclusively to protect pilgrims travelling to a holy land it no longer had any foothold in whatsoever, would spend the following 16 years trying, without any real success, to work out exactly what its own continued existence was actually for. It is worth holding honestly and without flinching from either half of it, both hands of what this same order had actually become by the moment its own mainland purpose collapsed at Acre, because the record this evening has just walked through leaves genuinely little room to doubt the Templars' own battlefield courage, discipline severe enough to expel a knight for charging too early, a Grand Master dying with a crossbow bolt in an unarmoured seam, rather than withdraw from a wall he had no remaining hope of holding, a marshal organising a refugee evacuation under his own negotiated truce even after the wisdom of continuing to fight at all had plainly run out, and an entire fortress choosing collapse over a second surrender. These are not the actions of an order that had grown soft on 2 centuries of donated land, and yet the very same order that produced that same courage had also, across those same 2 centuries, earned a reputation among a great many of its own contemporaries, Christian and Muslim alike, for an arrogance and a wealth-hoarding pride that sat uneasily beside its own sworn vow of poverty. Chroniclers of the period recording more than once, ordinary knights and commoners grumbling that the Templars fought bravely enough but seemed to fight, more often than strict piety alone would explain, for their own order's own advantage and their own order's own treasury rather than purely for the kingdom or the faith. Both were nominally serving, a rivalry with the Hospitallers, the other great military order founded in roughly the same period and governed by broadly similar rules that occasionally spilled over from mere professional jealousy into outright and genuinely damaging non-cooperation on campaign, the 2 orders on more than one documented occasion, refusing to coordinate strategy or share intelligence with one another out of little more than institutional pride. A rivalry that cost lives on at least a few of the battlefields this evening has already described, and it is worth naming specifically that this same criticism was not merely later historical judgment, but a live and recorded complaint at the time. The 12th century Archbishop of Tyre, a Levantine-born churchman named William, who served as Chancellor of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and wrote, in his own lifetime, the single most detailed surviving Latin chronicle of the whole Crusader period, recording, in language notably sharper than his otherwise fairly measured prose elsewhere, his own frustration at the Templars' habit of acting independently of royal and even patriarchal authority, most pointedly in his account of the assassination of the Ismaili envoys this evening has already described, a criticism worth weighing seriously, precisely because William of Tyre was no distant or hostile outside observer, but a churchman who had spent his own career working alongside the kings and the military orders he wrote about. And it is this same uncomfortable combination, real heroism married to real institutional arrogance, that a fair accounting of the Templars has to hold in both hands at once, rather than resolving too neatly in either direction. Once the mainland cause the order had been founded to serve no longer existed at all, that same tension only grew sharper, because a Templar Grand Master named Jacques de Molay, elected to the order's highest office in 1292, the year immediately following the fall of Acre, inherited an institution that still commanded immense wealth, immense landholdings scattered across the whole of Western Europe, and a standing military reputation built over 2 centuries, but that no longer had any actual territory left to defend. A genuinely awkward position that produced, across the 16 years of de Molay's own tenure, a series of increasingly unconvincing attempts to justify the Order's continued separate existence. Proposals, floated more than once within church councils of the period, that the Templars and Hospitallers should simply merge into a single, unified military order, pooling their considerable combined resources into one renewed crusading effort rather than maintaining 2 separate, expensively administered, and by this point openly rivalrous institutions. Proposal Jacques de Molay himself resisted with real determination, arguing in a formal memorandum he prepared for Pope Clement V in the early 1300s that the 2 orders' distinct traditions, distinct rules, and distinct institutional pride made any genuine merger more likely to produce damaging internal conflict than renewed crusading strength. An argument that was, on its own narrow institutional logic, probably not wrong, but that also, considered from the outside by kings and clergy who had spent 2 centuries watching the Templars accumulate wealth and privilege for a war effort that no longer had anywhere left to be fought, increasingly looked like an order more interested in preserving its own considerable fortune than in genuinely serving the crusading purpose that fortune had originally been justified by. The Order's own remaining military energy went somewhere revealing during these same final years, because rather than the Holy Land itself, now entirely closed to any renewed Christian foothold, the Templars' surviving field forces based themselves on Cyprus, participating, alongside the island's own Lusignan kings, in a series of raids and minor naval operations against Mamluk shipping and coastal targets that amounted, honestly assessed, to little more than harassment rather than any genuine strategic threat to Muslim control of the mainland, while simultaneously becoming entangled, closer to home, in an unedifying dispute over the Cypriot throne itself, briefly supporting one royal claimant against his own brother in a succession struggle that had nothing whatsoever to do with the crusading purpose the Order still officially claimed as its reason for existing. A small but genuinely telling sign that an institution built for one specific and now vanished purpose had begun, in the years immediately before its own destruction, drifting into exactly the kind of purely secular political entanglement its original rule had been designed to keep it well clear of. To understand why a king of France would choose, of all the wealthy and privileged institutions inside his own kingdom, to destroy this particular one, we have to look honestly at the specific and genuinely desperate financial position Philip IV had manoeuvred himself into by the first years of the 1300s. Philip had inherited a kingdom whose own royal finances, by the ordinary standards of medieval monarchy, were already stretched thin, and had spent the better part of his own reign fighting expensive and largely inconclusive wars against England over the Duchy of Gascony, against the Count of Flanders in a campaign that produced, in 1302, a genuinely humiliating French defeat at a battle remembered afterward as the Battle of the Golden Spurs, where a hastily assembled Flemish militia of townsmen and weavers destroyed a mounted French army considered, going in, one of the finest in Europe, and to fund these same expensive and inconsistently successful wars, Philip had resorted again and again to the kind of financial expedients that reveal a treasury genuinely running on empty, debasing the kingdom's own coinage, quietly reducing the actual silver content of French coins while insisting they still be accepted at their original face value, not once but repeatedly across his own reign, a policy that functioned, in practical effect, as a hidden tax on every single person who used money inside his kingdom, and that provoked, on at least one occasion in 1306, open rioting in the streets of Paris serious enough that Philip himself, unable to guarantee his own safety inside the royal palace, was forced to take shelter for several days inside the one building in the whole city fortified and independent enough to offer him real protection. The fortress this evening's opening scene has already named, the Paris Temple itself, sheltered, in one of history's more pointed ironies, by the very order whose own wealth he would move against only a year later. Philip had already turned against other groups inside his own kingdom, but at this same point, in his own ongoing search for money, because in July of 1306, only months before seeking shelter inside the Templars' own Paris headquarters, Philip had ordered the sudden and total expulsion of the entire Jewish population of France, seizing their property and their outstanding loans for the royal treasury in a single coordinated action that anticipated, in its own basic method if not its own final scale, the coordinated dawn raids this evening's opening has already described being carried out against the Templars themselves barely a year later, and Philip had likewise moved, across these same years, against Italian merchant bankers, the so-called Lombards operating in France, arresting them and confiscating a share of their own considerable wealth on charges of usury. A pattern, once it is laid out plainly and in sequence, that makes unmistakably clear exactly what kind of King Philip IV had become by the time his attention finally turned to the Templars, a monarch who had already discovered, through direct and repeated practice, that seizing the wealth of a group he could plausibly frame as outsiders, foreigners, heretics, or money-lenders, offered a faster and considerably less politically costly source of royal revenue than raising taxes on his own French nobility and clergy ever would. Philip had already set an earlier and genuinely startling precedent for how far he was willing to go against even the Church's own highest authority, when that authority stood between him and money he wanted, because in 1302 and 3, Philip had entered into open conflict with Pope Boniface VIII over the king's own right to tax French clergy without papal permission, a dispute that escalated on Philip's own orders into an armed raid led by his own chief minister, a lawyer named Guillaume de Nogare, on the Pope's own residence at Anagni in Italy, an assault during which the elderly Pope was reportedly struck or threatened by one of the raiding party, in an episode that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to rough medieval politics, and though Boniface was rescued by local townspeople before any lasting physical harm was done, he died within weeks of the ordeal, a sequence of events that demonstrated with brutal clarity that Philip IV regarded no institution in Christendom, not even the papacy itself, as genuinely beyond his own reach when his own interest demanded otherwise. And it was that same Guillaume de Nogare, the very lawyer who had led the raid on Boniface, who would go on to draft and organise the coordinated arrest orders this evening's opening scene has already described being carried out against the Templars, the same instinct for using accusations of heresy and moral outrage as a legal battering ram against an inconvenient institution, refined now against a considerably richer and considerably less well-defended target. The Pope Philip actually had to deal with in 1300, and 7 had already become genuinely compromised, because Boniface VIII's own successor lasted less than a year before dying suddenly himself, and the College of Cardinals, deadlocked and under considerable pressure from Philip's own faction, eventually elected a French archbishop named Bertrand de Gaulle, who took the name Clement V, a pope who never once, across the whole of his own reign, set foot in Rome itself, choosing instead to remain in France and eventually relocating the entire papal court to the city of Avignon, a move that placed the supreme head of the Christian Church within considerably easier reach of Philip's own royal influence than any pope in generations. Clement's own reputation among contemporaries did little to suggest a man likely to make a hard stand on principle against a king determined to have his own way. Chroniclers of the period recording, alongside his own chronic ill health, a pattern of appointing a striking number of his own Gascon relatives to positions of wealth and influence within the church, a nepotism ordinary even by the relaxed standards of the medieval papacy, but one that left him, from the very first months of his own election, more dependent on maintaining good relations with the powerful French crown than an earlier, more independently secure pope might have needed to be, and it was this same weakened, geographically captive, and by most modern historians' own judgment genuinely intimidated Pope who would be asked, within a very few years of his own election, to either defend an order that had served the Church faithfully for nearly 2 centuries, or to sign away its entire existence at the demand of the one king powerful enough to make his own continued position as Pope considerably more comfortable or considerably more difficult, depending on which choice he made. It is worth returning now to the same cold October morning this evening opened with, and looking at it more closely, because the accusations Guillaume de Nogaret's arrest warrant set out against the Templars that morning in 1307 were not modest ones, drafted in the weeks beforehand with the specific and deliberate help of a disgraced former Templar named Escue de Floiron, a man who had reportedly already tried and failed to sell the same accusations to the King of Aragon before finding a considerably more receptive audience in Philip's own court. The charges themselves alleging that every man entering the Templar order was made, as part of his own secret initiation ceremony, to deny Christ and spit or trample upon a crucifix, to exchange an obscene kiss with the officer receiving him into the order, and to worship an idol, a mysterious object later interrogators and later legend alike would call Baphomet, a name whose own origin remains genuinely disputed among modern scholars, some reading it as a garbled medieval corruption of the name Muhammad, reflecting centuries of confused and hostile Christian rumour about a supposedly secret Templar sympathy for Islam, others as an invention with no coherent meaning at all beyond its usefulness, as a name to hang an accusation of idol worship on, and the interrogation records further allege that Templar brothers were encouraged, even instructed, to engage in homosexual acts with one, another as a further expression of the order's own secret corruption, a bundle of charges that combined, with real deliberate cunning, exactly the accusations, heresy, sexual deviance, and secret ritual, most calculated to horrify a medieval Christian public and justify, in the eyes of that same public, whatever brutal measures the Crown chose to take in response. Stripped of the deliberately sinister framing Nogaret's interrogators built around it, the Order's actual secret initiation ceremony most likely involved something considerably more mundane, because the practice of admitting new brothers behind closed doors, without outside witnesses, was real and openly acknowledged by the Order itself long before any accusation of heresy was ever raised against it, a genuine secrecy the Templars themselves justified, in their own defence once the charges were made public, as ordinary and unremarkable, the same kind of closed-door admission ceremony any medieval guild, monastery or chivalric fraternity practiced as a matter of course. And it is this same real but innocent secrecy that gave Nogaret's interrogators exactly the raw material they needed, because a closed-door ceremony nobody outside the Order had ever witnessed could be described afterward by frightened men under torture as containing almost anything their questioner suggested to them, a kiss of obedience exchanged between the new brother and the officer receiving him, a genuine and unremarkable feature of medieval ritual submission, recorded in similarly innocent form in any number of unrelated ceremonies of the period, could be reframed, through leading questions and repeated suggestion, into the considerably more lurid obscene kiss the formal charges described, and a private vow of absolute obedience, sworn perhaps with language dramatic enough to test a new brother's own resolve, could be twisted in exactly the same way into an act of formal apostasy, which is very likely the actual mechanism by which a real but ordinary private ceremony became, in the mouths of exhausted men being burned on the soles of their own feet, a confession of secret devil worship their interrogators had, in every meaningful sense, already written for them before the torture ever began. Those same confessions were obtained in a specific and brutal way, because the men who confessed to these charges, Jacques de Molay among them, did so overwhelmingly under torture administered by royal officials and by inquisitors working directly under the Crown's own authority, rather than the Church's independent judicial process, methods that included prolonged starvation, the rack, and a particularly brutal technique involving fire applied to the soles of a prisoner's own feet. Torture severe and sustained enough that a considerable number of Templar brothers died in custody before ever reaching any formal trial at all, and Jacques de Molay himself, within days of his own arrest, confessed to at least some of the charges, a confession he would later, in a moment of real courage this evening will return to at its own proper point, publicly retract, but one that, extracted as it was within the very first days of an ordeal specifically designed to produce exactly this outcome, tells a modern reader considerably more about the effectiveness of medieval torture than about any actual crime the Templar Order had committed, a pattern repeated brother after brother across the hundreds of Templars taken into custody that same October, confession following confession, under methods designed to make refusal considerably more painful than compliance, until Philip's own officials had assembled within a matter of weeks exactly the mountain of seemingly damning testimony they needed to present the whole affair to the wider world as a genuine and thoroughly proven scandal rather than the engineered destruction of a rival institution it actually was. Philip's own government managed the public presentation of the whole affair with real care once the arrests themselves were complete, because Guillaume de Nogaret and the Royal Chancery did not simply arrest the Templars and leave the matter there. They organised, within days of the arrests, a coordinated campaign of public sermons preached in the squares of Paris and other major towns explaining the charges to an illiterate population that would otherwise have had no way of learning them, recruited theologians from the University of Paris to issue formal opinions supporting the Crown's own legal authority to act against the order even before any actual trial had taken place, and convened in the spring of 1308 an assembly of the Estates General, a gathering of nobles, clergy and town representatives from across the kingdom, specifically to demonstrate for Pope Clement's own benefit that the destruction of the Templars carried the broad support of the French nation rather than being the private grievance of the king alone, a genuinely sophisticated exercise in what a modern observer would have little difficulty recognising as coordinated state propaganda, built and deployed with a speed and a professionalism that suggests Nogaret's own government had been quietly preparing the ground for considerably longer than the sudden single morning drama of the arrests themselves might otherwise suggest. The whole affair played out unevenly once it spread beyond the borders of Philip's own kingdom, because the Templars were not in any meaningful sense purely a French institution. They held property and maintained houses across the whole of Western Christendom, and the response of other Christian rulers to Philip's own accusations varied enormously depending on how much each of those rulers actually stood to gain. King Edward II of England, initially sceptical and reluctant to move against an order he had no particular personal grievance against, eventually arrested the Templars within his own kingdom chiefly under sustained diplomatic pressure from Pope Clement himself rather than any conviction of genuine guilt, and English interrogators, working without the same systematic use of torture Philip's own officials had employed, obtained almost no confessions at all. In the Iberian kingdoms the outcome diverged even further, the King of Aragon actually besieging several Templar castles that refused to surrender peacefully, while in Portugal the order was formally dissolved only to be immediately reconstituted, its knights, its property, and very nearly its entire membership simply transferred wholesale into a newly created body called the Order of Christ, an institution that continued, under a different name and nominally different governance, doing very much the same work the Templars had always done, and that would go on, in one of history's stranger footnotes, to help fund and organise several of the great Portuguese voyages of exploration a full century later, meaning that the actual men, ships, and money of the Templar Order, in Portugal at least, never really stopped existing at all, and on Cyprus, where the Order's own field forces were still actually based following the fall of Acre this evening as already described, a formal trial was held that ended remarkably in a full acquittal, the Cypriot inquiry finding no credible evidence of heresy whatsoever, a genuinely striking outcome that stands in stark and telling contrast to the confessions extracted under torture inside France itself. A specific and genuinely brutal episode unfolded in Paris in May of 1310, one worth naming plainly rather than softening, because a substantial number of Templar brothers who had confessed under torture during the initial 1307 interrogations had, by this point, found the courage to appear before a papal commission investigating the order and publicly retract those same confessions, insisting, now that the immediate torture had ended, that they had confessed only to make the pain stop and that the charges themselves were false, a retraction that should, under ordinary church legal procedure, have reopened their own individual cases for fresh judgment, but that the Archbishop of Sens, a close ally of King Philip installed in his own position specifically to keep the French Church's judicial machinery aligned with the Crown's own interests, chose instead to treat as proof of relapse into heresy, a specific legal category that, under inquisitorial procedure of the period, could be punished by death regardless of whatever the Papal Commission's own separate investigation might eventually conclude. And on the 12th of May, 1310, 54 Templar brothers who had retracted their confessions were burned at the stake outside Paris in a single day, a mass execution carried out specifically to terrify any other Templar brother, still considering a similar retraction into silence instead. And it worked, the pace of retraction slowing considerably in the months that followed, a chilling and thoroughly cynical demonstration that in the France of Philip IV, telling the truth to a papal investigator carried a considerably higher practical risk than simply repeating whatever confession torture had already produced. Pope Clement, for his own part, spent the years between 1307 and 1312 caught in a genuinely difficult position, formally responsible for judging an order that answered, under its own founding privileges, to him and to him alone, while facing constant and increasingly forceful pressure from a French king who had already shown, at Anagni, exactly how far he was prepared to go against a pope who displeased him, and Clement summoned a great church council at Vienne, in southeastern France, in October of 1311, ostensibly to hear the full evidence and reach a considered judgment on the Templars' own guilt or innocence, a council at which, according to the surviving record, a majority of the assembled bishops actually favoured allowing the order a genuine opportunity to formally defend itself against the charges, since even by this point no independent investigation outside France itself had produced anything resembling reliable proof of the specific heresies alleged. But Philip, growing impatient with the council's own deliberate pace, arrived in person at Vienne in the early months of 1312 with an armed retinue considerable enough to make his own continued displeasure unmistakable, and Clement, faced once again with the same basic calculation that had shaped nearly every decision of his own papacy, chose not to force a genuine trial of the evidence at all, issuing instead, in March of 1312, a papal bull titled Vox in Excelso, that dissolved the Knights Templar not on any finding of proven guilt, but on the considerably more evasive grounds of what the bull itself called the order's own scandal, suspicion, and the damage its continued existence would do to the wider church, a formal dissolution that avoided ever actually declaring the order heretical while still achieving in practical effect exactly what Philip had wanted from the very first morning of the arrests. What actually happened to the Templars' own considerable remaining wealth once the dissolution was formally announced is its own small story, because Clement, in a further bull issued the following year, ordered that the great bulk of the order's own property across Christendom, its lands, its commanderers, and its remaining treasury be transferred to the Hospitallers, the Templars' own long-time rival order this evening as already described, rather than to the French crown directly, a ruling that denied Philip the outright windfall he had presumably hoped for, though Philip's own officials, administering the transfer within France itself, managed nonetheless to extract substantial administrative fees and outstanding debt repayments from the transferred estates before finally handing the remainder over, ensuring that even in formal defeat, the French crown still came away from the whole affair considerably better off financially than it had gone in, while the individual Templar brothers themselves, those who had not already died in custody or been burned at Paris, were for the most part quietly absorbed into monasteries, to live out their remaining years under a considerably less glamorous rule than the one they had originally sworn, or in a smaller number of cases granted modest pensions, a genuinely unremarkable and largely undocumented ending for the great majority of men who had once worn the white mantle and the red cross. A specific and genuinely remarkable piece of evidence surfaced not in the 14th century at all, but in the year 2001, nearly 7 centuries after these same events, because a Vatican archivist working through poorly catalogued material in the Vatican secret archives discovered a document that had been misfiled for centuries under the wrong reference number, a record now known as the Chinon Parchment, describing a private meeting held in 1314 at the castle of Chinon between senior cardinals acting on Clement's own behalf and the imprisoned Templar leadership, including Jacques de Molay himself, a meeting at which, according to the parchment's own text, the cardinals granted the Templar leaders formal absolution for whatever sins their own coerced confessions had described, restoring them, in strict church legal terms, to full communion with the Church as penitents rather than condemning them as unrepentant heretics, a document that shows, in the Pope's own private and considerably more candid legal proceedings, an implicit acknowledgement that the Church itself did not actually regard the order as guilty of heresy in any doctrinal sense, even while its own public dissolution the following year carefully avoided saying so outright, a discovery that has done more than perhaps any other single piece of evidence to confirm in the driest possible language of medieval canon law what most honest historians had already concluded from the surrounding circumstances, that the Templars were destroyed not because the Church believed them guilty, but because a king needed them to be. Jacques de Molay himself, together with 3 of his own most senior remaining officers, had by this point spent nearly 7 years in continuous captivity, and in March of 1314 a papal commission finally moved to pronounce a formal sentence on the 4 of them, a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death, a relatively lenient outcome given everything that had already happened, based specifically on the earlier confessions the 4 men had given under torture, and had, for the most part, never formally and publicly retracted the way the 54 brothers burned at Paris 4 years earlier had done, and it was at the public reading of that same sentence, delivered on a platform erected outside the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, before a crowd gathered to hear the whole long affair finally brought to its official close, that Jacques de Molay did something no one presiding over the ceremony had apparently anticipated, rising to declare, in front of the assembled crowd and the church officials who had just spared his life, that the crimes he had confessed to years earlier were entirely false, that he had confessed only because torture and the fear of death had broken his own resistance, and that the Templar order itself had committed no heresy of any kind, a public act of defiance. A fellow senior officer, Geoffroy de Charnay, immediately echoed alongside him, both men choosing at the very last possible moment when silence would have brought them nothing worse than a monk's quiet retirement, to die telling the truth rather than live having repeated a lie. That same defiance changed everything, because a public retraction of a confession, exactly as the 54 brothers at Paris had already discovered to their own cost, converted a case the Church had just settled with life imprisonment back into one of relapsed heresy, a category punishable by death, and Philip, informed of what had happened within hours, did not wait for any further church proceeding at all, ordering Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay burned at the stake that same evening, on a small island in the Seine known as the Île aux Juifs, near where the Cathedral of Notre Dame itself stands, a sentence carried out with almost no preparation and no further trial. The 2 men burned slowly according to the account that survives, specifically so that their deaths would take longer, and Jacques de Molay, in the last minutes of his own life, is said by a chronicler named Geoffroy de Paris, writing within a few years of the event itself, to have maintained his innocence to the very end, and called on both Pope Clement and King Philip to answer for what they had done to him and to his order, before God's own judgment, summoning them, in the specific phrase later legend would seize on and considerably embellish, to meet him before God's tribunal within the year. How much of what happened next is verified fact, and how much is later embellishment deserves an honest answer, because Pope Clement V did, in fact, die within a matter of weeks of Jacques de Molay's execution in April of 1314, from an illness his own doctors had already been treating for some time, and King Philip IV died that same November, thrown from his horse during a hunting accident at only 46 years old. 2 deaths following a very public deathbed curse, closely enough in time that the near-contemporary chronicler Geoffroy de Paris, our earliest surviving source for de Molay's own final words, explicitly connects them, treating the sequence as visible proof of divine judgment even in an account written only a few years after the fact, which means the core of the story, that de Molay cursed his persecutors and both men died within the same year, is not a later medieval or modern invention, but something close to the earlier surviving record of the event itself, though the far more elaborate later legend that the curse extended down through the entire Capetian royal line and doomed Philip's own sons to a swift and childless succession of early deaths, a version popularised centuries afterward, is a considerably later embellishment layered onto a genuinely striking coincidence, rather than a documented feature of the original 1314 story, a distinction worth holding on to, in keeping with this whole channel's own habit of naming plainly where a striking historical coincidence ends and a satisfying legend, built up afterward to make the coincidence feel more like justice, actually begins. Examined as a historian rather than as a storyteller, the actual surviving evidence for this whole affair is genuinely thin and genuinely contested, because nearly everything a modern reader can know about what the Templars supposedly confessed to comes down to us through interrogation records produced by the very officials who had every institutional incentive to extract exactly those confessions, using methods this evening has already described in plain terms, which means the underlying documents this whole 7-year prosecution rested on are, by the ordinary standards any court today would apply, close to worthless as evidence of actual guilt, valuable chiefly as evidence of what a determined state apparatus could make. Frightened, exhausted men, say, under sufficiently severe duress, while the considerably smaller body of evidence that survives from outside France, the Cypriot acquittal, the English trials that produced almost no confessions at all without torture, and now the Chinon parchment's own private absolution, points in a consistently different direction, an order that most likely practiced an unusually secretive initiation ritual, since the actual details even loyal Templar witnesses gave of that ceremony vary enough in small particulars to suggest a real, if considerably less sinister, private ceremony, rather than a uniform scripted lie, but that committed nothing resembling the systematic heresy and idol worship the French interrogations described, a case weighed honestly across all the surviving evidence rather than just the loudest and most dramatic part of it, that looks considerably more like judicial murder dressed in the language of religious scandal than like the exposure of any genuine secret conspiracy. This whole grand and dramatic story otherwise leaves a great many people quietly out of it, and they deserve remembering too, because for every named knight and every named king this evening has walked you through, there stood a far larger number of people whose own experience of these same 2 centuries left no comparable trace at all. The Sargent brothers, the non-noble majority of the Order's own actual membership this evening as already described, who did not sit for chronicled portraits or leave behind memoranda to popes, and whose own names survive, where they survive at all, chiefly as brief entries in inquisitorial transcripts recording what they confessed, under the same torture their knightly brothers endured, the tenant farmers and hired labourers who worked the Order's own commanderies across rural Europe for 2 centuries, whose own labour generated the wealth this whole evening has spent so long describing without their own lives ever entering the record in any individual way, the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem massacred at the story's own opening, and the considerably larger Muslim and Jewish populations whose own perspective on nearly 2 centuries of Crusader violence survives, in the European record this evening has necessarily leaned on most heavily only through the hostile or dismissive lens of the chroniclers who defeated and displaced them, and the wives, children, and elderly parents of every ordinary Templar sergeant or Cypriot garrison soldier who never returned from a campaign, left to manage a small family holding, or simply to grieve without any inquest or chronicle ever troubling to record their own names at all, a silence considerably larger than the dramatic and well-documented deaths of a Grand Master or a king, and one worth naming honestly before this evening moves toward its own close. Consider finally exactly what became of the Knights Templar in the centuries after their own actual destruction, because an order this dramatic, this wealthy, and this abruptly and violently ended left behind, almost inevitably, a body of legend considerably larger and considerably more colourful than the historical record this evening, has tried to stay faithful to a persistent and thoroughly unsupported tradition, first popularised by a set of forged 18th century documents with no genuine connection to the medieval order at all, claiming that surviving Templars fled underground and eventually founded, or at minimum secretly influenced, the fraternal organisation known as Freemasonry, a claim modern historians of Freemasonry treat with the same firm scepticism they apply to most such romantic origin stories, since the actual documented history of Freemasonry traces back considerably more plausibly to medieval stonemasons' guilds several centuries after the Templars' own dissolution, with no genuine surviving institutional link between the two, at all beyond a shared fondness on the Masonic side for adopting medieval and chivalric imagery for its own symbolic purposes, a similarly persistent legend surrounding a small and genuinely beautiful 15th century chapel in Scotland called Rosslyn, whose own elaborate stone carvings later popular writers have read as coded references to a supposedly Templar-guarded treasure, or to the Holy Grail itself, claims resting on considerably more imaginative interpretation than actual documentary evidence, and the broader and even older legend that the Templars had, across their own 2 centuries guarding pilgrim roads to Jerusalem, secretly recovered some sacred relic, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, or some other object of immense spiritual power, and hidden it, or its knowledge, for safekeeping once their own order faced destruction. A legend that draws part of its own persistent energy from one genuinely unresolved historical detail worth naming honestly, rather than dismissing outright, the fact that the Templars' own considerable fleet, based at the Atlantic port of La Rochelle, does not appear in the arrest records of October 1307, the way the Order's own land-based treasury and personnel so thoroughly do, a gap in the documentary record that has fed centuries of speculation that some portion of the Order's own ships, and whatever wealth they were carrying, slipped away before the arrests closed in. Speculation no surviving evidence has ever actually confirmed one way or the other, and that is considerably more likely, in the plain judgment of most serious historians, to reflect nothing more dramatic than the ordinary gaps and silences of an incomplete 700-year-old paper trail than any genuine escape treasure fleet, but a gap real enough and tantalising enough that even sober historians tend to mention it rather than dismiss it outright. A story with no genuine basis in any surviving medieval Templar record, but one that has proven, across the 7 centuries since, considerably more durable and considerably more commercially successful than the plainer and honestly stranger historical truth this evening has spent so long laying out, a truth involving considerably less buried treasure and considerably more torture, cynicism, and royal debt than the popular legend ever finds it convenient to mention. A far more modest but genuinely traceable piece of folk memory did survive from this whole story into ordinary modern life, the superstition surrounding Friday the 13th itself, because while this evening's own opening has already told you honestly that the specific pairing of this exact date with bad luck cannot be reliably documented before the 19th century, meaning nobody in 1307 actually experienced that Friday as uniquely ominous the way modern popular retellings often imply, the association nonetheless took firm hold once 19th and 20th century writers rediscovered the coincidence of date and dramatic content and began repeating it as established fact, which means the modern superstition, examined honestly, is less a genuine 7th-century-old omen than a considerably younger piece of storytelling that attached itself quite naturally to a date and an event dramatic enough to deserve the attention. A small final example of exactly the pattern this whole evening has tried to name plainly wherever it appeared. A striking historical coincidence gradually dressed up, well after the fact, as something considerably closer to fate. A great deal of the Templars' own genuinely real legacy survives today in places considerably less dramatic than any buried treasure, because the specific area of London, where the Order once maintained its own English headquarters, a walled precinct beside the River Thames that still bears the name Temple, and that today houses 2 of the 4 ancient legal societies governing entry to the English Bar, the Inner Temple and the Middle Temple, remains built in its own street layout and in the surviving round church at its own centre, a rare architectural echo of the distinctive circular chapels the Templars built across Europe in deliberate imitation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, meaning that a working barrister walking to court in London today, quite possibly without ever thinking twice about it, still crosses ground the Templars once owned and still passes, on the way, a church the Order itself actually built. And it is worth remembering too the specific and genuinely consequential afterlife the Order's own personnel and resources found in Portugal, where the Order of Christ this evening has already described the dissolved Templars quietly folding themselves into, went on, across the following century, to fund and organise a considerable share of Portugal's own great maritime voyages of exploration, its own distinctive Red Cross emblem painted directly onto the sails of the ships that carried Portuguese explorers down the coast of Africa and eventually around it, which means the same small red cross. Bernard of Clairvaux's own theological arguments first helped place on a knight's white mantle in the 1140s was still, nearly 3 centuries later, flying over ships opening, sea routes that would go on to reshape the entire structure of global trade, a genuinely remarkable and rarely told continuity between a medieval crusading order and the opening chapters of a considerably more modern kind of European expansion. The specific financial machinery this evening described the Templars' pioneering letters of credit honoured across long distances by a trusted network of local branches, quietly became the basic working template for the whole of later Western banking, the checking account, the traveller's cheque, and the international bank transfer a modern listener uses without a second thought, all rest, in their own most basic underlying logic, on precisely the same principle. A nervous pilgrim once relied on riding east from a Templar house in London toward one waiting for him in Jerusalem. Deposit here, withdraw safely there, trust the network rather than trust the road, an idea so thoroughly absorbed into the ordinary infrastructure of modern life that almost nobody using it today has any reason to know it, once belonged to an order of warrior monks burned, in its own final generation, on the orders of a king who owed that same network more money than he could ever hope to repay. It is worth naming plainly exactly which voices this whole 200-year account has actually been built out of, and exactly whose interests each of those voices carried into the telling, because no single source this evening has drawn on comes to us free of its own particular angle. The rule of the Templars itself expanded over time from its original 72 Latin clauses into a considerably longer French version running past 600 articles by the Order's own final century, tells us with real precision what the Order expected of its brothers, but says nothing at all about whether those same brothers actually lived up to it. William of Tyre's own chronicle, already named this evening for its criticism of Templar independence, was written by a churchman with his own institutional rivalry with the military orders and his own loyalty to the royal court of Jerusalem, which shapes, in ways worth remaining alert to, exactly which Templar failures he chooses to linger on, the surviving Muslim chroniclers of the period, writers like Ibn al-Athir and Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, who together preserve most of what we know about Hattin and Saladin's own conduct, afterward from the Muslim side of the field, wrote as loyal servants and admirers of Saladin's own court, which means their considerably more favourable portrait of his mercy and his statesmanship deserves the same careful, not uncritical reading. This evening has tried to apply to every Christian source in turn the interrogation transcripts from 1307 onward, our single largest body of evidence for the order's own final years, were produced by torturers with an openly stated goal, and Geoffroy de Prix, the rhymed vernacular chronicler who preserves de Molay's own final words at the stake, was writing in French for a French audience within a few years of the event, sympathetic enough to the Templars' own fate to record their defiance in vivid and memorable detail, but still, in the end, a storyteller shaping a scene for maximum effect rather than a court stenographer. And it is only by holding all of these voices up against one another, a rule against a trial record, a hostile Latin chronicle against a hostile confession, a Muslim court chronicler against a French street chronicler, that anything resembling a fair picture of these 2 centuries becomes possible to assemble at all. It is worth sitting, too, honestly, with exactly how much of this whole catastrophe actually depended on choice rather than fate, because it is tempting, looking back from a comfortable distance of 7 centuries, to treat the destruction of the Templars as some inevitable collision between an outdated crusading relic and an emerging modern state. But the actual record this evening has walked through resists that same tidy framing at almost every turn. Nothing about Philip's own mounting debts made the specific choice to destroy the Templars, rather than simply borrowing further or taxing his own nobility more aggressively, an inevitable one. Nothing about the Order's own considerable wealth made Jacques de Molay's own decision to resist a merger with the Hospitaller, a merger that might have diluted the Order's own separate identity, but would very likely have spared its individual brothers, a decision he could not have made differently, and nothing about medieval church procedure made Pope Clement's own choice to dissolve the order on vague grounds of scandal rather than risk his own position by actually defending it. The only path open to him. Each of these was a specific, human, and in hindsight, genuinely costly decision made by a specific person weighing his own interests against a considerable amount of uncertainty, which means the fall of the Templars belongs less to any grand and impersonal current of history sweeping an outdated institution aside, and rather more to an accumulating chain of individually explicable, individually self-interested choices, a king's debts, a lawyer's ambition, a pope's fear, a grand master's own institutional pride, each one reasonable enough on its own narrow terms. That happened, in the end, to add up to a catastrophe none of the men making those choices necessarily set out to cause. Let us walk back, gently and one last time, through the whole long shape of everything this evening has actually carried you across, because it is a considerably longer and considerably stranger arc than any single scene inside it can fully convey on its own. 9 knights with barely enough horses to go around began in 1119 by guarding a few dangerous miles of road outside Jerusalem, and were transformed within a single decade by the personal advocacy of Bernard of Clairvaux and the formal blessing of a church council at Troyes into a fully sanctioned religious order permitted, for the first time in Christian history, to kill as an expression of holy obedience rather than a sin requiring penance. That same order grew, across the following century, through an unbroken tide of donated land and donated wealth, across the whole of Western Europe, into one of the largest landowners and one of the most sophisticated financial institutions the medieval world had yet produced. Its own network of fortified houses stretching from Portugal to the Baltic, its own letters of credit carrying pilgrims safely across a continent, its own Paris headquarters managing the private treasury of the kings of France. Its knights fought, and very often died, with a discipline that earned them command of a shattered crusading army in the 1140s, and that same discipline, undone by one Grand Master's own long-nursed personal grudge, marched a kingdom's entire field army into a waterless trap at Hattin in 1187, and watched 200 of its own captured brothers executed on a single afternoon for the crime of being too dangerous ever to safely ransom. It held the line at Acre for 2 centuries and finally lost that city, and with it the last mainland foothold of the entire Crusader project, in a siege whose own final days saw a Grand Master bleed out from an unarmoured gap in his own armour, and a fortress collapse deliberately onto the last of its own defenders, rather than surrender a second time. And having survived all of that, having outlasted the very cause it was founded to serve, it was destroyed in the end not by any Muslim army, not by any pope's genuine conviction of its guilt, but by a French king drowning in debt, a lawyer who had already learned exactly how to break a pope at Anagni, a set of confessions extracted by fire applied to the soles of frightened men's own feet, and a single, carefully coordinated Friday morning in October, when 9 knights' original 200-year-old dream of holy poverty was unmade, in a matter of hours, by the plain, unphilosophical, and thoroughly unsacred hunger of a treasury that had run dry. That brings us at last to the end of our story, and to whatever quiet thought you want to carry out of it, and into your own sleep tonight. There is something worth sitting with gently in the shape this whole evening's story actually took, an order that spent 2 centuries building the most disciplined and most feared reputation in medieval Christendom, and that discovered, in the end, that no reputation, however hard won and however genuinely deserved, offers any real protection at all against a powerful man who has already decided what he needs from you, and has simply been waiting for the right morning to take it, Jacques de Molay dying. Not because he was guilty of anything the record can actually support, but because he had, without ever fully realising it, become more useful to a desperate king dead and disgraced than alive and solvent, and there is something worth carrying forward too from the 2 men who chose, at the very last possible hour when silence would have cost them nothing further, to stand up in front of a crowd and tell the truth anyway. Not because it saved them, it did not, but because some things, a man's own honest account of his own life, are apparently still worth more to some people than 1 more comfortable year bought by a lie. Before we let this particular evening go, if this slow and unhurried way of telling a very old story is genuinely the kind of thing you find yourself wanting more of, staying with this small channel and helping it along on its own quiet way toward 10,000 subscribers would mean more than you probably realise sitting there right now. If you're watching this on YouTube, remember that the Spotify link waits for you down in the description, since new stories have taken to landing there just a little before they reach this screen, and if you're listening on Spotify tonight instead, a quick search for Historian at Midnight over on YouTube will show you the rest of what this small channel has been quietly building. And if you would like to, leave your own city and your own local time down in the comments, because somewhere out there tonight, under some entirely different stretch of sky, another tired stranger is very likely settling into this exact same slow, unhurried hour. Whatever it is you carried into tonight, whatever debt, whatever unfinished argument, whatever small worry has been sitting on your own chest since long before this story ever started, it is almost certainly smaller, examined honestly in the dark, than the weight 9 tired knights once carried on a dangerous road, or the weight a Grand Master carried into his own final fire rather than tell 1 more lie. And if their own story could still find its way, after 2 centuries of blood and betrayal, to some kind of rest at last, then yours can certainly find its own way there tonight too. Close your eyes now, if they are not closed already, and let the rest of this night carry you the way it is always going to carry you regardless, gently, and without needing anything further from you at all. Good night, and sweet dreams.